Hello, and welcome to this presentation on backward design for learning. This presentation is included in a larger suite of workshops and presentations in Olympic College's Spring 2022 Assessment Day. So here you'll see on my title screen, I have kind of a graphic here that's illustrating the cyclical and iterative nature of the backward design process. So I'm going to kind of go through this process in detail during this presentation. Some of you may already be familiar with the fundamental concepts in backward design. Some of you may already be integrating some of these principles into your workflow. And for many of you, this might be your first exposure to this design process. And so I'm hoping that you'll, at the end of this presentation, be able to take away some valuable information and really use that to inform your course design process and your ultimately your instruction. So I'll go ahead and get started here with some objectives for this presentation slash workshop. So the first thing that we'll do is to distinguish between traditional or forward, sometimes called forward models, and backward design models. Secondly, we'll identify the stages of the backward design process. There are three main stages. And finally, we'll determine if and how backward design can inform your course design process. Pardon me. So the first thing I'd like to do is to just kind of explore this definition of design that comes from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. And design is defined here as a verb, which means to devise for a specific function or end. And the reason why I'm including this definition of design is because actually design is backward design. So backward design is really just a kind of a fundamental way of looking at the design process that focuses on the end result or the end goal. So when we're talking about backward design for learning, often the end goal is the objective or the outcome, whether that's at the unit level or even down to the assignment level, or up at the course level, program level, or even talking about institutional objectives or goals. So if you are thinking about the end, at the beginning of your process, you're already doing backward design and you're already really doing kind of good design. But many of us are not. So, I can tell you that when I began teaching about 10 years ago, sociology to undergrads, I really was so passionate about the subject matter. I was really inspired by a lot of the materials that I was reading and other kind of pieces of information that I was consuming, and I was invigorated to share that with my students. And I think that my passion came through, my inspiration came through, and my students gravitated towards that. But that's not the most sustainable model for instruction, right? You may not have that same passion and that same inspiration in perpetuity. And so really I was relying upon a forward design model. I would find materials that I thought were interesting or cool, or that challenged, the kind of traditional paradigm that many students had, and and I would kind of build my curriculum around that. So selecting the instructional materials first, then thinking about how to develop assessments, and to measure essentially student learning, student achievement. And many of the assessments that I ended up developing using this forward model, or maybe an intuitive model, just whatever came naturally, maybe didn't necessarily measure the stated learning objectives effectively, or they only partially measured those objectives. So when I first was exposed to backward design, it really was a kind of a sea change for me. It really fundamentally shifted the way that I thought about designing instruction. and I think has resulted in a much higher quality learning experience for my students. And you know, is evidence based, and of course contributes to the institutional goal of aligning assessments with outcomes and really mapping those assessments up to program level outcomes and even institutional level outcomes or goals. So the first thing I'd like to do is just start with a reflective question. You know, this is something you might want to think about. So I'm really interested in hearing from you about your process. So please take a moment to kind of think about your approach to designing units, modules, or whole courses. Now, units or modules or chapters or weeks or whatever you break your instruction down into, whatever the kind of smaller units that you use are. How do you go about designing those, right? Where do you start? Do you start with instructional materials? Do you start with a cool book that you have read? Do you start with, publisher provided materials? Do you ask a colleague to share their materials, which is, I think a really great way to start and is quite common at my institution at least. What's your approach? Do you start with learning goals? Do you start with course objectives and then work backward from there? Let me know how you go about the course design process. Okay, and since this presentation is intended for all of you, wonderful kind of academics who don't just take the word of an instructional designer as authoritative, which models critical thinking, I think, and is really important. You want to see evidence, right? And preferably, you'd like to see evidence that has gone through the peer review process. So I found a few studies that I thought I'd share with you. Both of these studies are from different cultural contexts. So they're from Iran, and the second study, I believe, is from Argentina. And both of these studies are dealing with English as a foreign language, or sometimes we call it English as a second language here in the United States, learners. But the first study showed that backward design was pedagogically and statistically significantly superior to conventional forward models in the improvement of EFL learners' writing ability. So this was, done in a kind of experimental way. They had a control group. They had an experimental group who received the stimulus, and in this case, the stimulus was curriculum developed using a backward design approach. And they saw more improvement in the stimulus group or the experimental group than they did in the control group in terms of writing ability. So, improved writing ability was greater in the experimental group in this study. Second study is also an experimental approach. Students who were part of the experimental group exposed to curriculum developed using backward design showed higher achievement on summative assessments and greater satisfaction than students in the control group. So once again, we're talking about English as a foreign language. That seems to be quite popular to use these experimental research designs to explore the impact of backward design for this subject matter at least. But both showed that backward design was statistically significant in terms of its benefits. Okay, next up I want to discuss the stages of backward design. There are three main stages of backward design. They're pretty straightforward, but we'll unpack each of these stages. So the first stage is to identify the desired results. And as educators in public institutions of higher education, like Olympic College, often these desired results are determined, either outside of our department or division. So, you might have program level outcomes that are determined by members by committee members within your department or division, or folks outside of that. Course level outcomes also tend to be determined within the department or division, although not all members of the department or division might have control or the ability to change those outcomes. So what I'm getting at here, that the desired results are often already determined, and we are kind of working within that framework. That doesn't mean that you can't interpret course level objectives into module level objectives or even assessment level objectives. Those, you have some flexibility around. So, of course, the end result needs to reflect the course level objective, but you might have a kind of, sub objective that you use, or enabling objective would be a term that instructional designers would use to describe some objectives that kind of scaffold learners towards the achievement of a greater objective or outcome, which might be the course level or the program level. So the first step is to identify that desired result. Second step is to determine acceptable evidence. So this has to do with assessment. What are you going to accept as acceptable evidence of the achievement of the desired result? This is where you can start to think a little bit maybe more creatively than you've thought about assessment in the past. So for instance, if I have a desired result or a learning objective that says students need to work with peers effectively, right? And also, I might have another objective that says students need to be able to define key terms in the study of global stratification, right? So, we have two kind of objectives here. They might seem a little bit disconnected, but thinking creatively about how students can achieve both of those objectives, or what type of evidence that we might accept, we might be able to formulate an assessment plan that enables students to achieve both of those objectives in ways that potentially give them some choice, control, and the ability to present authentically. So, if we have this interact with peers effectively and we have this defined terms objective, then maybe we want to think about creating some sort of assessment where students are working together, interacting effectively. This is, potentially an online course, so that might be a discussion forum. It might be a kind of multi-stage research project where students work within groups to achieve a common kind of goal. And also in the process, they might be defining these key terms, right? So, you could imagine some sort of discussion prompt that required that students respond multiple times to their peers, which is the interacting effectively together, and at the same time, they're defining those key terms within their posts, right? So you might require that they, define 4 of the key terms in modernization theory and dependency theory, 2 major theories of global stratification, in their posts, right? So in this way, we're, letting students kind of, interact with one another freely while also meeting learning objectives. Now, another layer to this might be to allow those students some choice as to how they present their definitions, right? So, we have a discussion forum, but as you know, in Canvas and in many learning management systems, those discussion forums allow for posting of images, videos, audio files, links to external sites. So you could imagine students recording short video lectures and sharing those with their peers, recording an audio file, maybe kind of modeled on their favorite podcast that educates their peers, or maybe even developing an infographic using a tool like Canva, or even animations using a tool like Powtoons to achieve that desired results. And finally, the fun part is planning the learning and instruction. This is where you're kind of curating the learning experience. I say fun part because I really enjoy this part. This is where I select materials for my students. These are often the materials that I know are going to kind of support them as they move towards those desired results. So these could be textbook readings, these could be journal articles, key pieces of research, other types of readings that really support students as they move towards achieving the desired result, the learning objective. But they could also be, different types of instructional activities and learning materials that are interesting to you and that you would like to share with your students. You can also consider which of these learning activities and instructional materials are really germane to the desired result. They're absolutely vital, and which of them are maybe even supplementary, which I think is also great to provide students, especially those who want to kind of elevate their understanding and explore a little deeper, supplementary materials. Okay, so next up I want to unpack each of these stages of the backward design process in a little more detail. So the first step here, first stage, is identify the desired results. This kind of visual is helpful to think about identifying that desired result and maybe thinking about categorizing your instructional materials when you get to that point as well. So what's really important for achieving this enduring understanding, and what is maybe supplemental. So 3 rings here. The outer ring represents information that is worth being familiar with. The second ring represents information that is important to know and do. And the third ring, the most important, is the enduring understanding. So this is really what you want students to take away. So this can both inform the selection of instructional activities and learning materials, but it can also inform the way that you write enabling objectives that support the course learning objective and the program learning outcomes or objectives. So, if I'm thinking about the global stratification example again, right, because I teach sociology and this is a major unit in my sociology course. There's definitely a lot of information that I want students to be familiar with, right? So, if we're talking about 2 major theories of global stratification, dependency theory and modernization theory, I probably want students to be familiar with the idea of associated dependent development, which is, a concept developed by Fernando Cardoso that says, essentially that nations that are economically underdeveloped need to kind of detach from the global economic system or the global capitalist system while they work on internal development. Using other kind of economic strategies to really build up their own industries and build up their own institutions before they then transition into global markets when they are at a place where they can be competitive, right? That's important. That's worth them being familiar with, but it's not, absolutely vital to them achieving my ultimate desired result, which we'll get to in just a bit. Important to know and do, right? So, there are definitely some other kind of pieces of information that I think are important for them to know and do. In this category, I might put a concept like import substitution industrialization, or ISI. This is the idea that nations that are underdeveloped in the global capitalist system need to detach from that system, once again, and they need to substitute imports with, their own kind of production. So import substitution industrialization. So instead of importing, automobiles, you make your own automobiles. Instead of importing, technology like microprocessors, you produce your own, right? And this is really important for understanding the fundamentals, particularly of dependency theory, but also modernization theory. But it's still not getting towards the enduring understanding, right? So the enduring understanding, what I really want students to take away from their intro unit to global stratification are the basic assumptions of dependency theory. That nations are poor not because of any kind of fault of their own, but they're poor because of exploitation within the global capitalist system that originated with colonialism. So that's one of the basic assumptions of dependency theory. Modernization theory, the basic assumption is that nations are poor because they fail to adopt the cultural and structural qualities of rich nations. And in order to achieve economic development, they need to adopt those qualities. Additionally, they need to meet a certain kind of threshold for achieving what's called the takeoff stage, where they can see exponential economic growth. So those are really the enduring understandings, right, that I want. So if I was going to write a module level objective for my global stratification unit, and I'm thinking about this hierarchy, I probably want to make sure that enduring understanding is included there. So I might write something like students should be able to define the basic assumptions of dependency and modernization theory, right? That would be, my enduring understanding as it's translated into a learning objective. And I think I explicated that learning objective in a way that uses measurable verbs that align with kind of lower level or lower order tasks in Bloom's taxonomy. Okay, step 2. Determine acceptable evidence. Determine acceptable evidence. So this is where we start to think about assessment and what types of evidence that we'll accept. So a couple of questions to think about here. How will I know if students have achieved the desired result? Right? And secondly, what will I accept as evidence of student understanding and proficiency? So I'm going to actually start with the second one. What will I accept as evidence of student understanding and proficiency? This is where I'd like you to really start thinking, kind of outside of the box, outside of traditional ways of thinking about assessment. That might include some form of high-stakes summative assessment that has lots of close-ended questions on it, like multiple choice and true-false, which are fine, for certain tasks and for measuring certain outcomes, but are insufficient for many others. And the research, of course, is pretty clear that some students perform really well on those types of high-stakes summative assessments. Those students tend to come from dominant group backgrounds, and other students don't perform as well, right? And disproportionately, those students represent demographic groups that are underserved. So in terms of thinking about what you'll accept, I think ideas around universal design for learning. So allowing students multiple ways to engage with the material and with their peers, and multiple ways of expressing themselves or of acting, right? So these are both two central pillars of universal design for learning. How can you, allow students to achieve desired results in ways that connect with their with their preferences, right? I'm hesitant to use learning styles because there's a lot of research that's kind of debunking this idea of learning styles. But how can you let students maybe even authentically express themselves in order to achieve a desired result, right? So this aligns with the ideas of authentic assessment, which we'll talk about a bit later in this presentation. And then how will you know if students have achieved the desired result? So this is where you start to think about how you're going to measure achievement. Is it a certain threshold? Do students need to, score above a certain percentage in order to demonstrate achievement of a desired result? Do they need to demonstrate mastery or, high level of proficiency, which is where the vocabulary is going around those terms? in order to move on to to the next step or to the next outcome. And if this is the case, do you allow students multiple opportunities to demonstrate that high level of proficiency or that mastery? Or once again, is this a high stakes summative assessment that students need to demonstrate mastery on one attempt, and they don't have any other attempts, or how are you structuring this assessment? You can also start to think about transparency here, so providing rubrics, which is something that you can do in Canvas relatively easily, is quite effective in creating a kind of transparent environment for students around assessment. They understand your expectations, they understand the criteria they're being scored on. But providing lots of scaffolding within assignment directions can also be an effective tool here as well. So these are a couple questions to think about in this stage. Okay, and finally, the fun part. So planning that learning and instruction. As I mentioned previously, you can think of this as kind of curating the learning experience. There are several questions we need to think about here. So first off, what enabling knowledge will students need to achieve the desired results? If you want students to, in a statistics course, if you want students to do a descriptive statistical analysis, right, they're going to need to know how to do the essential kind of statistical tasks in order to produce that analysis. So that might include the enabling knowledge around calculating mean, median, mode. Measures of central tendency and measures of distribution are really fundamental to a descriptive statistical analysis. So that would be kind of breaking down, right, that goal, the desired result, the learning goal, into its constituent parts, and really thinking about how you can provide instructional materials and activities that transmit that enabling knowledge to students, that enable them to achieve the desired result. What are the best materials to use? We can start to think again here about universal design for learning, is in particular the concept of multiple means of representation. There may not be just one best material. I think it's, really effective to provide students with options in terms of the material that they consume, or to provide a diverse array, right? So it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily have, redundancy in your materials. Like, you don't need to have a reading that is also, kind of packaged into a video or something like that. That would be, that's not objectionable. I think that'd be a good thing to include, but it's not, that's not exclusively what we're talking about here. But if you can provide students a variety of materials, right? So things like, scholarly articles, peer-reviewed materials, textbook readings, but also thinking about how you might incorporate audio, images, case studies, databases, right? Infographics, of course, video in its various forms. All of these are instructional materials, and they, can be presented to students in of course, different formats that connect with students' preferences. What activities are best suited for the learning goals? So this is where you want to think about, which activities are going to be really most aligned with that learning goal. So if your learning goal is that students interact effectively with each other in a small group setting, then a textbook reading on communication or interaction in a group might not be the most effective way, right, for to kind of support students as they achieve that learning goal. Maybe they need to see a video demo. Maybe they need to read a case study. Maybe they need to actually practice in groups, right, in a safe space. Kind of doing some formative assessment where they can fail and really in a safe environment. Okay. Is the content coherent and cohesive? So, are you chunking your content appropriately? Is it sequenced in a way that is coherent and cohesive? I think, sometimes it helps to have a colleague or someone who is a little less close to the material review your material and your course design and provide some feedback. What seems coherent and cohesive and logically related to you might not seem that way to a layperson or to fresh eyes. So this would be, a way that you can kind of vet your material for coherence and cohesion. Okay, next up I want to talk about some design considerations. I've already touched on a few of these, so I won't go into a tremendous amount of detail around some of them, and others I'll dive into a little bit deeper. But if you're thinking about kind of designing, using the backward design approach, starting from your outcomes, thinking about evidence assessments, and then moving into instructional activities and materials, as you're going through this process, there'll be certain inflection points where you can really incorporate some design principles that are associated with better student outcomes, right? And that are, evidence-based in their own right, or their effectiveness is evidence-based, I should say, in their own right. So I did talk about universal design for learning. This includes multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression, and multiple means of engagement. I do have some resources that I'll share with you at the end of this presentation if you're interested about incorporating universal design for learning into your design process. But this is an effective approach to creating a robust and really enriched learning environment. Authentic assessment. So I mentioned that previously as well, but authentic assessment is the idea that students might benefit, I should say, from some control over how they achieve learning objectives. That some students may benefit as well from being able to incorporate or connect their lived experience to assessments and ultimately to the achievement of learning goals. So how can you create assessments that really value your learners' lived experiences, right? Now, in the social sciences and sociology, I can think of many, many ways to do this. If we're talking about social inequality or poverty, I can ask students, what their experience is with this with this concept in their own life or in their interactions with others, right? How has poverty affected you? That's pretty straightforward. Now, in other disciplines, it might be a little more difficult, but I would argue that this is possible in almost any discipline within higher education, right? Even in some kind of high-level mathematics courses, there are opportunities, maybe in the examples that you use for practice questions or test instruments or test questions to allow students to connect with their lived experience, right? Or at least ask them to reflect on what they've learned. How might you use this, right, in your own, kind of life or academic career or in a professional setting? Tilt and scaffolding. So TILT refers to a framework called Transparency in Learning and Teaching. I mentioned this previously. It goes along with scaffolding. TILT is really just being very clear about your expectations for students and providing adequate support resources, for achieving learning objectives, right? So this might mean just being really, really transparent about all of the resources that the college offers, the technical support, student supports, financial supports, other types of support that they might benefit from, but also being really transparent about your expectations for achieving that desired result or that learning objective, right? So, for instance, if I'm creating a discussion discussion forum as an assessment for students, and I want them to reply to their peers, I might include really detailed instructions on what I expect from that reply post, right? We've all seen discussion forums where students reply, hey, good job, or, nice work, or I agree, or I don't agree, which are fine in their own right, but don't push the dialogue further and don't really contribute anything to the discussion and are just quite superficial in nature, right? So if you want to avoid superficial reply posts in discussion forums, you need to tell students what you expect. In your reply post, you should ask a question. You should restate, right, what the original poster said in your own words to demonstrate understanding. You should provide constructive feedback. And here are some examples of how you provide constructive feedback, right? So that really is being transparent and scaffolding that discussion forum to, increase interactivity and to increase the substantiveness, right, of that forum itself. Alignment. So, maybe this should have been first because you can't talk about alignment without talking, you can't talk about backward design without talking about alignment. Alignment refers to the alignment of learning objectives with assessments and instructional activities, right? So this is the essence of backward design. A course designed using the backward design process is just inherently going to be characterized by alignment. Now, ultimately, an aligned course is a course that is going to demonstrate or going to, is going to show student achievement of course level objectives, which should map up to program level objectives, which in turn should map up to institutional level objectives. So when administrators are thinking about accreditation visits, when they're thinking about documenting student learning, alignment is key, is fundamental to that process. You can't really document student achievement of institutional learning objectives without an aligned course. So thinking about the alignment during the backward design process is incredibly important, and not only benefits students because students understand why they're completing activities and they understand the connection between the learning goals, the assessments, and the materials, but it also benefits the institution and just creates, once again, a more enriched learning environment. I would always recommend thinking about accessibility and doing that proactively. It's much easier to do accessibility proactively as you're designing a course than it is to go back and revise one for accessibility, right? Now, there's a lot of detail here, and there's accessibility can get quite complex and technical. It's not always that way, and there are a few tricks and tips that you can just carry with you throughout your course design that will really promote accessibility or generate some really, significant returns on your efforts. Those include things like using heading structures, avoiding color contrast, or using color alone for emphasis. To make sure that you have header rows in your tables and table captions. All of these things, of course, are really important towards creating accessible materials. Making sure that you have captions in your videos, either selecting videos that have professional captions already, or sending those videos that you want to use over to us in the Center for Learning Innovation in order to do professional captioning. Finally, I want to talk about a way of thinking about instructional activities and materials. This comes from a model of thinking about instructional activities developed by Horton. This is the Absorb, Do, Connect model. Horton breaks down instructional materials and activities into these three categories. And Absorb are those types of content exposures that provide students enabling knowledge to move through an assessment and demonstrate achievement of a desired result. So these could be things like lectures, they could be videos, audio files, any way that you can kind of expose students to content. And once again, going back to the UDL idea, you want to have multiple ways of exposing students to content. Do are instructional activities that students are, actually engaging in, right? To do something that either demonstrates achievement of the desired result or moves closer to demonstrating achievement of the desired result. So do might be, things like reviewing a case study, right, and responding to a case study. It might mean doing live polling in the classroom where students participate on their smartphone using Kahoot, which is a piece of ed tech that allows for these dynamic types of polling and even to kind of gamify the learning experience by making it competitive, right? I had an instructor several years ago who shared a PowerPoint template for a Jeopardy game, right? And so, you could, create some sort of gamified experience, a Jeopardy experience for students. And this is, really kind of dynamic and, of course, active learning as well. And Connect is connecting with other learners, connecting with the material, and also connecting with how that knowledge will be used. So this could, mean in a workforce course, say, a welding course, that students start to, connect what they're learning with what they'll actually be doing on the job. Maybe this is done through a reflection paper. Maybe this is done through a final project that ends up being a portfolio piece as they move into the labor market and begin their kind of job search, right? So Connect is connecting with other learners and connecting with connecting with that knowledge that's going to be important in a professional setting. Okay, so finally, I'd just like you to kind of reflect on your questions, challenges, or any changes in processes that you may see as a result of this presentation. So, what questions do you have about backward design? If you're wondering how you can integrate it into your course design process, I'd be happy to, meet with you one-on-one and kind of coach you through this process and brainstorm on ways that it might be relevant to you and your discipline. What challenges do you foresee, right? Maybe there are some factors that are outside of your control, and you'd be really interested in seeing how you could incorporate backward design, but still use the department mandated learning outcomes. How does this change your process, right? Maybe you're shifting from a forward design process where you started with instructional activities to really looking at those learning objectives first and foremost, and then kind of working backwards from there. So what kind of changes do you foresee as a result of learning a little bit about backward design? So go ahead and take some time to reflect on this and send any questions that you have over to me or to the Center for Learning Innovation. A couple of selected references here. There's a more exhaustive reference list on the Canvas site that I created for this presentation. And then finally, as I mentioned, you can send your questions to me. You can also send them over to the Center for Learning Innovation at distancelearning@olympic.edu. And we'd be happy to field any questions that you have. So finally, I would just like to show you really quickly here the Canvas site for this workshop. So the presentation that I delivered is loaded in here. I have some resources for you. So these are resources that are kind of specific to backward design as an approach to course design or instructional design. These are some of the really kind of fundamental readings and resources around backward design that I thought would be important to share with you. There's also some more specific Canvas resources here. So these are more technical in nature, but they enable you to they provide the enabling knowledge, right, for you to actually carry out the backward design process. So I thought those might be kind of useful for you. There's also a few templates that you can take a look at. So there's a detailed template. This comes from Grant Wiggins, who is the author of Understanding by Design, a kind of foundational text in backward design. I did not create this document, so the color contrast is does not align with WCAG standards. This is this is bad color contrast, this red text, but I didn't want to alter the original version too much. I'll let you look over this document. Like I said, it can be quite helpful in kind of reframing and breaking down the backward design process. And then finally, there's a simplified template. So this template is something that I created. It's a pretty straightforward kind of template that will get you started on the process, but you might want to use that detailed template if you're going to approach this with any level of complexity. So the first section here, you state your course level outcomes. Then you kind of cull your enduring understandings from those course level outcomes like I did in the presentation. You start to think about the acceptable evidence, and then the assessment instrument that you'll use is acceptable evidence, and then finally thinking about planning that learning experience and instruction. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you so much for attending this presentation. I really enjoyed interacting with you all. Once again, send any questions you have over to me, Chris Cook, ccook@olympic.edu, or distance learning at olympic.edu. Take care.